Welcome back to class. Take a seat, get comfortable. Today we're covering 10 of my favorite topics in all of psychology. Not because they're flashy, but because once you learn them, you genuinely cannot unsee them. You'll notice them in advertisements, in conversations with your family, in your own decisions by the end of this hour. Here's how we'll do this. For each one, I'll show you the actual research behind it, real studies, real names, real numbers. Then we'll talk about two things: how it's used on you, often without your awareness, and how you can use the same principle ethically in your own life, at work, with people you care about, or just to understand yourself a little better. I want to be upfront about something before we start. None of what I'm about to teach you is a secret. It's published, peer-reviewed psychology, much of it decades old. What makes it feel like a secret is simply that most people go their whole lives without anyone sitting them down and explaining it clearly. That's what today is for. Grab a notebook if you'd like. Let's begin. Trick 1: the Reciprocity Principle. Let's start with one of the oldest and most powerful principles in all of social psychology: reciprocity. Here's the rule. When someone does something for us, even something small, even something we didn't ask for, we feel an almost involuntary pull to do something back for them. This isn't a personality trait. It appears to be close to a universal feature of human social behavior, found across virtually every culture studied. Psychologist Robert Cialdini, in his research on influence, described a striking experiment. Restaurant servers who gave customers a small mint with the bill saw tips increase modestly. Servers who gave 2 mints saw tips increase even more, not proportionally but dramatically. And servers who gave 1 mint started to walk away, then turned back and gave a second mint while saying, "For you nice people, here's an extra," saw the largest tip increase of all. Same 2 mints. Different framing, very different result. Why does this happen? Evolutionarily, reciprocity likely helped early humans build cooperative relationships that were essential for survival. A society where favors were returned was a society where people could trust each other enough to share resources, defend each other, and cooperate over time. We're descended from groups where this instinct was strong. How it's used on you. Free samples in stores aren't generosity. They're designed to trigger a subtle sense of obligation. Salespeople who do you a favor before asking for something are using the same principle. How to use it ethically. This is genuinely one of the kindest principles in psychology to apply intentionally. Small, genuine acts of generosity, without keeping score, build real goodwill over time. The key word is genuine. Reciprocity used manipulatively eventually gets noticed and damages trust. Reciprocity used sincerely is simply called being a generous person, and it works precisely because it's real. Trick 2: the anchoring effect. Here's one that affects nearly every negotiation and purchase decision you'll ever make, often without you noticing it at all. Anchoring is the tendency to rely too heavily on the first piece of information you receive when making decisions, even when that information is completely irrelevant to the decision at hand. The classic demonstration comes from Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky. Participants spun a wheel rigged to land on either a low number or a high number, clearly random, clearly meaningless. Then they were asked to estimate the percentage of African countries in the United Nations. Participants who'd seen the high number on the wheel gave significantly higher estimates than those who'd seen the low number. The wheel had nothing to do with the question, and yet it changed the answer. This is why the first price you see on a menu, a real estate listing, or a salary negotiation matters enormously, even if that number gets adjusted later. Your brain uses it as a reference point, and every subsequent number gets evaluated relative to that anchor, rather than on its own merits. How it's used on you. Retailers show it was $200, now $99, priced specifically to anchor your sense of value at $200, making $99 feel like a steal, regardless of what the item is actually worth. How to use it ethically. In a negotiation, a salary discussion, A price negotiation, being the one to state a reasonable but ambitious number first, genuinely shifts the entire conversation in your favor, simply because of how anchoring works. The ethical line is honesty. Anchor with a number you can justify, not one designed purely to deceive. Trick 3. The mere exposure effect. Here's a strange one. Simply being exposed to something repeatedly, with no other information at all, makes us like it more. Psychologist Robert Zajonc demonstrated this in the late 1960s with a series of elegant experiments. He showed participants nonsense words, unfamiliar Chinese characters, and even photographs of strangers' faces, varying only how many times each one was shown. Across the board, the more frequently something was seen, the more participants rated it as likable, even when they had no idea what it meant and no memory of having seen it before. This is part of why familiar brands feel trustworthy even without evidence of quality. It's part of why songs you disliked on first listen sometimes become favorites after the fifth or sixth time. Your brain interprets familiarity as safety. Something unfamiliar might be dangerous. Something you've encountered many times without harm gets quietly tagged as safe and likable. How it's used on you. This is the entire logic behind repetitive advertising. Brands don't need you to remember the ad. They need your brain to register the exposure, which happens automatically beneath conscious awareness. How to use it ethically. This one is wonderfully simple to apply to your own life. If you're getting to know someone new, a colleague, a potential friend, simple repeated, low-pressure contact builds warmth more reliably than one intense interaction. Consistency itself is persuasive. It's also a good reason to give new foods, books, or experiences more than one try before deciding you don't like them. Trick 4. Loss aversion. We touched on this briefly in an earlier video, but it deserves its own deep dive, because it might be the single most exploited bias in modern marketing and decision-making. Loss aversion, again from Kahneman and Tversky's research, describes the finding that losses feel roughly twice as painful as equivalent gains feel good. Losing $100 hurts more than finding $100 feels nice, even though, mathematically, they're identical in value. This asymmetry shapes decisions far beyond money. People stay in unfulfilling jobs because leaving feels like a loss of security, even when a new opportunity offers greater expected reward. People hold on to failing investments rather than sell, because selling makes the loss feel final and real. How it's used on you. Don't miss out. Limited time only. You're about to lose your discount. Every one of these phrases is engineered specifically to trigger loss aversion rather than to highlight a genuine gain. Notice how rarely marketing simply says, "This is a great product," without a loss-framed deadline attached. How to use it ethically. Understanding your own loss aversion is the real gift here. When you're paralyzed about a decision, leaving a job, ending a relationship, trying something new, ask yourself honestly, am I weighing this rationally, or am I overweighting the fear of loss compared to the actual potential gain? Simply numbing the bias when you feel it often loosens its grip enough to think clearly. Trick 5. Social proof. Humans are, fundamentally, a social species, and one of the fastest mental shortcuts we use is simply, what are other people doing? Social proof is the tendency to look at others' behavior as evidence for the correct course of action, especially in situations of uncertainty. Psychologist Solomon Asch demonstrated a striking version of this in the 1950s. Participants were shown a line, then asked to match it to one of three comparison lines, an extremely easy task with an obvious correct answer. But when surrounded by actors instructed to confidently give the wrong answer, roughly a third of participants conformed and gave the same incorrect answer themselves, at least once, simply because everyone else had said it. This instinct made sense for most of human history. If everyone around you is suddenly running, the rational move is usually to run too, rather than stop and independently verify the danger. Conformity, in an uncertain or dangerous environment, was frequently a survival advantage. How it's used on you. Bestseller. 9 out of 10 people recommend this. Customer review counts displayed prominently next to products. None of these tell you anything about quality directly. They tell you what other people chose and trust that you'll follow. How to use it ethically. If you're trying to build a new habit, surrounding yourself with people already doing that behavior, a running group, a study group, leverages social proof in your own favor. It's also worth simply remembering, the next time you feel pressure to do what everyone else is doing, that the line-matching experiment proves the obvious answer and the popular answer aren't always the same thing. Trick 6. The foot-in-the-door technique. This one describes a pattern of escalating commitment, and once you see it, you'll spot it everywhere. In a landmark study by psychologists Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser, researchers asked homeowners to place a small, unobtrusive sign in their yard supporting traffic safety. Most agreed easily. It was a minor request. 2 weeks later, a different researcher visited the same homes and asked an enormous favor: permission to install a large, unattractive billboard on their front lawn. Remarkably, homeowners who had agreed to the small initial sign were far more likely, in some versions of the study, several times more likely, to agree to the large billboard than those approached cold. The mechanism here is consistency. Once we commit to something small, we develop a self-image as the kind of person who does this. Each subsequent, larger request gets evaluated not purely on its own merits, but against that self-image we've already built, and refusing starts to feel inconsistent with who we've decided we are. How it's used on you. Free trials that require a credit card. Small initial commitments. Just answer this one quick survey question that leads step by step toward a much larger ask. Sales training across industries explicitly teaches the foot-in-the-door sequence. How to use it ethically. This is genuinely one of the most useful tools for building your own habits. Want to start exercising? Don't commit to an hour daily. Commit to putting on your shoes and walking outside for 5 minutes. Once that small commitment becomes part of your self-image, the larger habit follows far more naturally than willpower alone could achieve. Trick 7. Cognitive dissonance. Here's a deeply human discomfort, and understanding it explains a remarkable amount of seemingly irrational behavior. Cognitive dissonance, first described by psychologist Leon Festinger in 1957, is the mental discomfort we feel when we hold two contradictory beliefs, or when our actions contradict our beliefs. Crucially, Festinger found that humans are highly motivated to resolve this discomfort, and often, rather than changing the behavior, we change the belief instead, because beliefs are usually easier to adjust than actions we've already taken. In one of Festinger's most famous studies, participants were paid either $1 or $20 to tell another person that an extremely boring task was actually enjoyable. Counterintuitively, the participants paid only $1 later rated the task as more genuinely enjoyable than those paid $20. Why? The well-paid group had an easy external justification for lying the money. The poorly paid group didn't have that excuse, so to resolve the dissonance between, I said this was fun, and I was barely paid to say it. Their brains adjusted the underlying belief instead. They convinced themselves it really had been somewhat enjoyable. How it's used on you. Once you've made a public commitment or a costly investment, financial, emotional, or otherwise, you become motivated to justify that choice to yourself, even in the face of contrary evidence. This is part of why people defend expensive purchases or poor decisions long after the evidence suggests they shouldn't. How to use it ethically. Awareness here is mostly protective rather than something to deploy on others. When you notice yourself defending a decision unusually strongly, ask whether you're defending it because the evidence supports it, or because you've already invested in it and dissonance is doing the talking. Trick 8. The halo effect. Here's a bias that shapes how we judge nearly everyone we meet, often within the first few seconds. The halo effect describes our tendency to let one positive trait, often something as superficial as physical attractiveness or a confident first impression, color our judgment of someone's entirely unrelated traits, like their intelligence, honesty, or competence. Psychologist Edward Thorndike first documented this in 1920, studying how military officers rated their soldiers. He found that ratings for completely distinct qualities, physical ability, leadership, character, intelligence, were far more correlated with each other than they should have been if evaluators were judging each trait independently. A soldier rated highly on one dimension tended to be rated highly across all of them, suggesting evaluators were forming one overall impression and letting it bleed into every category. Later research confirmed this extends powerfully to physical attractiveness. Attractive people are consistently rated, by strangers with no other information, as more intelligent, more trustworthy, and even more competent at their jobs, assessments that have no logical basis in appearance whatsoever. How it's used on you. Advertising frequently pairs products with attractive, confident spokespeople, specifically to transfer that halo onto unrelated qualities like product reliability. Job candidates who are well-dressed and confident in interviews are often rated as more competent, independent of their actual answers. How to use it ethically. The protective use here is mostly about catching yourself. When you notice you're forming a strong overall impression of someone very quickly, it's worth deliberately separating the traits. Is this person actually skilled at this specific thing? Or am I assuming it because I like them generally? This single habit meaningfully improves the quality of decisions like hearing and evaluating others' ideas. Trick 9. The Bystander Effect. This one is sobering, but essential, because understanding it can genuinely change how you behave in an emergency. The bystander effect describes the finding that individuals are less likely to help a person in distress when other people are present, compared to when they're alone. And counterintuitively, the more bystanders present, the less likely any single person is to act. This was studied intensively by psychologists John Darley and Bib Latané, following the widely reported 1964 case of Kitty Genovese, a young woman attacked in New York while, according to initial reports, numerous neighbors failed to intervene. Darley and Latané identified the core mechanism as diffusion of responsibility. When many people witness an emergency together, each individual feels less personally obligated to act because responsibility is unconsciously shared, and often, everyone assumes someone else will step in or already has. In their experiments, participants who believed they were the only witness to a simulated emergency intervened the vast majority of the time. Participants who believed several other people were also witnessing the same emergency intervened dramatically less often, and far more slowly when they did. How to use this for protection, not exploitation. This is one of the most genuinely actionable pieces of psychology in this entire video. If you are ever in an emergency needing help, do not shout, "Somebody help me." Diffusion of responsibility means a crowd may collectively do nothing. Instead, point directly at one specific person. You, in the blue jacket, call an ambulance, which assigns individual responsibility and reliably produces action. And if you are ever a bystander, simply knowing this bias exists measurably increases the likelihood you'll personally step in rather than assume someone else will. Trick 10. The Spotlight Effect. Let's end with one that I think brings genuine comfort once you understand it. The spotlight effect, researched extensively by psychologist Thomas Gilovich, describes our tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people notice and remember about us. Our appearance, our mistakes, our awkward moments. In one well-known study, Gilovich had participants wear a deliberately embarrassing t-shirt into a room of strangers, Then estimate what percentage of people in the room had noticed it. Participants consistently overestimated this number by roughly double the actual figure. We believe we are the main character in everyone else's story, when in reality, most people are far too absorbed in their own spotlight effect, worrying about how they themselves appear, to devote much attention to cataloging our flaws. How it's used mostly, this one is used on yourself. Social anxiety, fear of public speaking, and reluctance to try new things in public are all powerfully fed by an inflated spotlight effect. Marketers occasionally exploit this too, implying that everyone will notice if you don't have the right product. But mostly, this bias quietly shapes our private decisions far more than anyone else's judgment of us ever does. How to use it for yourself. The genuinely useful application here is simply remembering the t-shirt study the next time you're paralyzed by fear of embarrassment. The honest, well-researched truth is that almost no one is watching as closely as you fear. That single fact, internalized, has helped more people overcome social anxiety than almost any other piece of psychology I teach. So there you have it, 10 well-documented, genuinely researched principles of human psychology. Reciprocity, anchoring, mere exposure, loss aversion, social proof, foot in the door, cognitive dissonance, the halo effect, the bystander effect, and the spotlight effect. None of these are secrets reserved for marketers or manipulators. They're published science, available to anyone willing to learn them. And I'd argue that's exactly the point. The same principle that a dishonest salesperson uses to pressure you into a purchase is the principle a kind friend uses, completely innocently, to make you feel welcome and valued. The psychology itself is neutral. What matters entirely is the intention behind how it's used. My hope for you, leaving this class today, isn't that you become suspicious of everyone around you. It's the opposite. I hope you become a little more aware of your own mind, a little less afraid of the spotlight, a little quicker to step in when someone needs help, a little more honest with yourself about why you're defending a decision so strongly. That awareness, practiced consistently, is really what psychology is for. I'll see you in the next class. Please like, share, and subscribe the video.